Okay, this is Julie Pearson, Little Thunder with the Oklahoma Oral History Research Program at Oklahoma State University. Today is Thursday, May 6, 2021, and this interview is for the Library of Congress Occupational Folklife Project funded by the Archie Green Fellowship. This is a remote interview with Eyakem Gulilat. I am in Tulsa, and Eyakem, you're in Oklahoma City, where you serve as the Cultural Development Director at the Oklahoma Arts Council. Because you are a photographer in your own right, born in Ethiopia and now working with the OAC, I knew you would be perfectly situated to talk about the structural and sociocultural challenges of some of the women artists in this series. Thank you for taking the time to be with me today.
Well, thank you.
For starters, where were you born and where did you spend some of your growing up years?
Okay, well, good afternoon. I was born in Ethiopia and grew up there until I was about 10 and then moved to Kenya where I became a teenager, I guess, and a Kenyan by identity, if you want to call it that, as a teenager, right? So. And then we moved to the States or America when I turned 19. So, yeah.
And where in the States did you go first?
So my American home is Austin, Texas. So that is our first place in America. I mean, Texas was it, the state.
What were your impressions of Austin?
Well, so growing up, particularly in Kenya, we used to watch a show called, I think, Dallas, I believe, sitcom. So, of course, my expectation of Texas is based on that series, TV series. I mean, it wasn't that far away from that, right? So, sure, yeah.
How did you end up coming to Oklahoma from Texas?
From Texas, graduate school. So I finished undergrad in West Texas at a liberal arts university called Abilene Christian. And I came to OU to attend graduate school.
What was your first experience with art, however you want to define it, kind of your first memories of something?
If you asked me this question 10 years ago, I would have said I did not have any art, right? But having worked at the agency, I think my earliest memories of art is based on the Ethiopian national TV where they promote different tribal dances, right? And I think I wouldn't consider that art though, right? That was part of the culture. But I think to me, that is the first time that I think I encountered that idea of art or that is partially important to certain tribes. Why is tribe A dances different to tribe B? And how do they get that promoted? I mean, so there had to be some sort of training, which, I did not internalize that. But also, Ethiopia had, I was growing up, I think it was, as a child, Ethiopia was a communist country. So theater was a big deal. I have never gone to theater, but I always hear people talk about theater performance. In fact, Othello was a big deal, right? So the only thing I know of that story of European literature is Othello. I mean, it's so funny, right? Yeah. So I think those are my first and earliest memory of art in a very vague way, right? So,
how about photography, which you do? When did you first get interested in photography?
So I was never interested in art. So when I went to college, I wanted to be an engineer, not a photographer, not an artist, or anything to do with any liberal arts courses, actually, right? But I had to take an elective course in the arts in order to graduate. By the way, I'm an engineering dropout, so I'm not an engineer by any means. So, but I thought that I could be a photographer, right? The reason is, as kids back in Ethiopia, my brother and I used to watch this German detective show, a police show, where this dictative used cameras as a way of, establishing proof of criminal activities. So really enjoyed that clicking noise it made. So my mother had this Russian-made camera that we did not have films for. So I'd be chasing my younger brother in rural Ethiopia and photographing him, and I would make images. There are no images, but the sound is the only thing that is made. So that was sort of that was just being or reenacting what I saw, what it meant to be cool, right? It's not because I was art. However, my photographs in my first elective art course were all about photojournalism, right? And I had no idea what photojournalists did. But I have seen photographs. I mean, I love newspapers. And the only reasons I liked newspapers were for the photographs and how the photographs told the story, particularly how the written words made the images become more vivid, right? So, and I was an avid newspaper reader. So, but in the back of my mind, Kevin Carter's photograph of starving Sudanese girl curled into a small bowl waiting to go to this feeding center, which in 1994 or 93 won the Pulitzer Prize award for that image. So that image was subconsciously embedded in my being, right? So no wonder what I was producing in my art class, in my elective art class, was all about this sort of perceived ideas that I had through reading newspapers back in Ethiopia as a kid, reading newspapers in Kenya as a kid, and really maybe I was just responding to those things that I was seeing. And that's when my teacher told me, "You have an eye for photojournalism." Photojournalist. So that is where the whole photography career started for me. And I left that university because they did not have a good photography program. So went to a different college.
Came to Oklahoma at some point, right? For University of Oklahoma.
Right.
And got your degree in in fine arts there. How long have you been with the Oklahoma Arts Council?
Well, coming up June would be 2 years.
Okay.
So fairly new. So.
Yes. And how did you get involved with them?
Currently I'm finishing up my PhD in city planning. So my photography sort of has kind of allowed me to be really curious about communities. So my work is revolving around mostly communities, particularly marginalized or underrepresented or immigrants, whatever you want to use in that. But also very much interested in how these communities create a space for themselves, right? Places that meet their social, economic needs. And city planning was that natural transition into that. So I just finished 2 years ago. I finished my coursework for my dissertation, and I was looking for an employment. And uh, this job description or cultural development director was what I saw when I searched on higher ed jobs, right? So
Right.
it was only natural. I mean, the description, the job description at that moment was really describing who I am, creating cultural, sort of empowering cultural production, if you want to call it that, within the context of promoting folk and traditional art, using data to measure the impacts of the arts on Oklahoma, on Oklahoma's economy, and diversity, equity, and inclusion. Right. So this is I've never done any of these things, but the jobs that I did as a photographer for the last 15 years really has equipped me to understand these nuances, right? So that's how that marriage started between myself and the Arts Council. So,
Well, a lot of our discussion today will have to do with kind of language, beginning with the notion of art, which is kind of problematic. And can you explain what some of your feelings are about it?
oh man, I mean that's very loaded, right?
Yes.
So perhaps maybe I will begin maybe to talk about this based on my own identity, particularly that of an African descent, uh, Ethiopia and Kenya, and then here. So within the context of my upbringing, Ethiopia, Kenya, and even my Ethiopian communities in the States, we don't use the term art, but we do things that affirms our cultural identity. But because that language is not a definition, whether how we worship in churches, the music, the clothing, the Ethiopian clothing. In fact, when we promote what it means to be an Ethiopian, we dress in that Ethiopian clothing, but we never consider that art. Though as a now as a fine artist trained in art, I definitely consider that performance art, right? Because everybody's collectively performing in this clothing, and we wear this clothing during special ceremonies, weddings, funerals. No, not funerals per se, but Ethiopian New Year's and other holiday markers. Songs are a good example, particularly so as a Christian, the way Ethiopians sing, it's a totally different way of singing. And that is asserting that cultural nuance. So hence, it's performance art, right? Other things include the Amharic alphabet writings that because we don't use the I guess the English alphabet or the Latin alphabets, that becomes part of art. You know, right? So I think because I am trained in the art field, and looking back into this culture, I see everything that we do as being art. Speaking of the language in itself, right? All this becomes art. So for me, then, when I define art in society, whether it is the larger American culture, I do have a very broad way of defining it. I extend it outside of the cultural institutions, right? The museums, the galleries. So coffee shops, which, by the way, with an Ethiopian product, right? So that in itself, for me, going and watching and observing coffee consumers is a form of art, right? We don't grow coffee in the States or European countries. Therefore, we depend on the production of the coffee farmers practice in Ethiopia or Africa, for that matter, or Latin American countries, where coffee is grown and produced. But the end users are participating in that cultural production of those countries that they don't actually see. So for me, not to be way too overly winded, how I define art is very broad, right? So it becomes daily rituals, daily rituals becoming cultural practices, and cultural practices being defined by those communities that want to prevent those cultural way of doing things, right? I mean, food is a good example, right? In America, I think one way of majority citizen participate in the consumption of culture is through food. I mean, I can have an Ethiopian cuisine and I can define it as such, or a Mexican cuisine and I can define it as such, and people willingly choose to participate in that production of. So yeah, my definition is a bit broader than what we do. So.
Well, along those lines, you often refer to artists as cultural workers. You want to expand a bit on that?
Cultural workers. So, because I see art as a way it allows people to see one another, I see it activating social norms, or used as a tool to make cases for groups that are marginalized as they exist. And at the same time, art makes that marginalized groups of individuals more visible through the process of the production of the art, right? So for me, then, any individual that is embedded in creating a body of work as a case maker, or as a case making, I should say, is a cultural worker. And it's very strange that in a sense, cultural workers in my head is intertwined with activism, representation, a way of making othering more palatable, right? Or humanizing otherness into the mainstream American culture. So I often use that term very loosely as cultural workers, but also we use that today in our society, particularly in America, as a way of creating a sense of community, whether it is gender identity or racial identity, religious identity. All this then become this sort of a product of culture, right? A subculture, right? So that's why I use that term to kind of to think of it as holistically, if you want to even use that word.
What does the Arts Council have to offer, actually, people from underrepresented communities or cultural workers from underrepresented communities? What would you like them to know about the Oklahoma Arts Council?
Well, one of the commitments that we have at Oklahoma Arts Council is that we want to have art accessible to all Oklahomans, right? What does that mean, and how do you get access to all Oklahoman communities? So, particularly when we talk about art or cultural activities, they seem to be located in urban centers. So, by defining it, art for all Oklahomans, that has created in us to make an extra effort to reach into rural communities. So one thing that one of the portfolios that we have that we use is folk and traditional art. It's a newly we used to have it at the agency, and budget cuts and many other issues revolving around that concept uh, we haven't had the program, and we are re-establishing, and I am overseeing the re-establishment of folk and traditional art. So within that program, rural communities, diverse communities, whether Native Americans, recent immigrants. By recent immigrants, I mean newly resettled communities, like the Vietnamese immigrants, which we have a fairly large population here in Oklahoma, and many other new Americans, and any other emerging cultural activities, whether now within the context of folk and traditional art, hip hop is considered a folk and traditional art. Quilting within particularly African American communities is a big deal, right? It's an expression of the arts. Or even, since I'm talking about African American communities, the church as a cultural outlet. Meaning, now, we're not in the business of proselytizing, so I want to be very clear about that. But there are certain cultural nuances, right? Other things include that in my conversation with rural communities, the dying practice of cattle branding is an example that falls under that. It's a very inclusive way of looking at the culture that made Oklahoma, Oklahoma. The other areas that we do really try to do to promote cultural activities is through education. Educational component is a vital part of it. K to 12, college education, and the importance of art and awareness of otherness within the larger Oklahoma society. So yeah.
Yeah, it sounds really exciting, actually. What are some of the challenges that you faced in starting up this program again?
There are challenges in doing this. When you have a new program, first would be reaching out the larger community, so PR work. Where do you begin? Anyway, so since I started I joined the staff and shortly after COVID. So working in sort of like what we're doing right now, like this digital platform has been very, very limiting. But also it has created a little bit of an opportunity. Phone calls become vital, particularly when we're talking about cultural work for the agency. Other areas would be obviously, funding. Everybody will have issues with lack of funding for this type of work. It's not just Oklahoma, but I think it's a phenomenon expressed throughout the nation when it comes to this type of work. What else are there? Probably I'm forgetting some thoughts, but I think that's what the other challenges is really, again, because the definition of art or folk art or traditions is so subjective to certain communities, that convincing them that they are artists is another, I think that is, to me, the biggest challenge, right? And I think that comes with a lot of patience on my part, and it takes time to establish relationships. So establishing the relationship, and then seeing that value that these communities have as an artist. In my own personal work as a photographer, I'm documenting the entire panhandle of Oklahoma, and even in my interaction, photographing some of the individuals, they shy away from my camera because they don't have anything positive to say, or well, they're not positive, but they cannot be perceived in that they're not worthy of my camera, right? Mm-hmm. That mentality, it's not in a negative way. It's just being shy, I think. But I can only overcome that by consistently appearing in the community over and over. So building relationship is vital in this work. And so I guess maybe the challenge is that I want to see quick things happen. and being patient and also I guess is a challenge. Because we are an agency that is funded, that we have responsibilities to those fundings, and therefore we have to have those measurable outcomes. And relationships are part of those, and it takes a long time, right? Trust is a challenge. I'm saying that in a positive way, right? Mm-hmm. And it has to be so, right? We're working in that.
Sometimes just even the grant process is sort of hard for underrepresented communities. I don't know if you're thinking about specific things in those areas or not.
Absolutely. I mean, our agency organizations have to be a 501c3, right? I myself did not understand those mechanisms, right? I know what nonprofit is, but not really understand what it takes to form a 501c3, right? Board members, right? Having the dues. So this structure are foreign to most communities that I am reaching out to, particularly immigrant communities or rural communities for that matter. Mass migration out of rural communities to city centers don't have the capacity to have the population that could take in different roles of the board members. So you need to have a certain number of board members in order to, so that structure is very complicated. But, and then I think that is where folk and traditional art comes in, right? Within the context of apprenticeship program, which we don't have, but I think eventually we would get to that where we can potentially work with a master artist and an apprentice, apprentice, if you can say that, and that these two individuals work in tandem in preserving their cultural heritage, where funding could potentially go directly to this two group of individuals in promoting cultural identity of a larger population of that group. So yes, I mean grants are challenging. The other is, in fact, I would use my own self, is that lack of awareness on what Oklahoma Arts Council does in community. Right? I was not aware of. I even as an artist, I was aware what Oklahoma Arts Council is, but not completely aware the magnitude of work is that the agency does in communities. It's not just art; it's from economic development to capacity building to partnership generation. So, and a lot of the groups that I work with, not being aware of that is also a challenge. And how do you bridge that gap? And that requires, again, that phone call, site visits, which we can't do right now. Right. Which my favorite part is actually site visit, right, into these different communities. You begin to absorb the unspoken description of a space or a place that these communities participate in. So, yeah.
Yes, and I was going to ask about the pandemic challenges, but you kind of covered them. I do think when the public knows something about the OAC, they typically think in terms of like festivals, maybe, or special exhibitions, or at museums, or what's the OAC's relationship with institutions of higher education or museums or festivals? Is it changing a little bit? I know this is not in your area per se, but
Yeah, this is not in my area, and I'm not, I think so. We have a grants department, so I don't see the day-to-day activities. However, we are very big on promoting festivals. In fact, we have different types of grants, and our small grants predominantly benefit those festivals. In fact, as you said, festival, the first thing that came to mind was Sorghum Festival in Wewoka. I attended that, and it brought a diverse population. I think a small town would swell up into so many vendors and art activities, from Native American art performance to gospel singing to making of the syrup from the sugar cane or sorghum cane.
Sorghum, yeah.
So, to different Native American cultural expo. Others include Strawberry Festival in, I forgot, don't quote me on it, but I think Salazar. So there are all this. Still, yes, there are small, and these are, the heartbeat of most communities. In fact, I have not done an extensive research or studies on this. I do feel these activities bring the largest revenue for these communities because of the number of visitors that are coming to visit this town. So, and I think that's what I also get excited. And I think that's where, when I talked earlier on about art for all Oklahomans, the festivals become part of that expression. And a lot of the smaller towns' cultural expression happen through this. And so whether it is music, I think even some towns that are on Route 66, this is where we fund activity, some in the name of art. We activate social interaction, economic activity, and even community development, right? So, yeah.
You've talked a little bit about how artists, the women artists in these series who may be born in another country and become bicultural or polycultural here, the kind of work that they can do in deconstructing otherness. But I wonder if you could expand on that a little more. And maybe it just strikes me that during this pandemic, that's been a bigger danger than ever before. I mean, that's been a bigger need to sort of deconstruct, be working on that than ever before. Maybe because we're just so isolated from each other right now.
Mm-hmm. So ask me that question again.
Yeah. You've talked a little bit about how art or cultural work, representation can help deconstruct otherness, and how important these women who've, were born in another country but are living here, who are bicultural or polycultural now, the important role that they can play in that. Let's just start with that.
Sure. Speaking about those artists, right? I kind of put myself in that category as well. And so I'm going to talk from my own personal experience as well. One thing I've noticed is that this type of artists usually have the burden of representing their own cultural heritage, no matter how traumatic or positive those cultural backgrounds are for these individuals who left that country and moved to this other country, America. But there is no way that we can erase those identities that formed our being in our birthplaces. So, and perhaps maybe I'm overly stepping my boundary by saying that, but it's my observation with some of my artist friends that I have, and that they have this overburdening responsibility of representing their culture while being or trying to be as individual and marketable and bridging that American audience. So there is that struggle that I have noticed. But sometimes, not sometimes, but oftentimes, beautiful things happen, and I think that becomes that American product, right? That is the way how, if I kind of use in a very sort of, I think the way you described it becomes the art production, right? You want to define yourself in this landscape or in this American shores by really looking deep inside of you. And when you do that, this beautiful things emerge, right? So the question is, and I often ask my friends in this capacity, would your work be the same if you are not in the States, right, in America? Or how would your perception of self shift because of your identity as an immigrant, right? And how do you also speak to the host culture, or I don't want to say the host culture, but who is here beyond the indigenous people of America, right? So essentially, we are all trying to figure that out, particularly the European immigrants and recent immigrants, and in the same way, we are asking that question. How do you? I feel that's what I see by the production of this artist's work. So when they present their labor of love, it really does make the American audience to question their positionality. As a woman, as a man, as a European, or you can go on, as religion, right? All these things come, and I think it's beautiful benefit to those that have never been able to have that consciousness. Maybe that's not a good word, but to have asked that question, right? I know, and I have met a number of people that have never left a county, right? So how do you know yourself better if it wasn't for this immigrants, right? I feel like I'm advocating for immigrants here, but beyond the immigrants would be even Native American artwork. I have seen a number of Europeans collect Native American artwork, and I've always wondered, why is that, right? In what ways does it create a sense of humanity through this process? And I don't know, maybe I've gone off tangent to the question, so I apologize.
I thought that was very eloquent. Your answer was very eloquent. What's a project or upcoming program, and maybe just resuming the program you've been trying to work on that was suspended by the pandemic, but what's a upcoming project that you're looking forward to when we sort of shift back into normal again, or close to normal?
Absolutely. I really do miss the very few months of experience that I had with site visits. I think I am a cultural worker. So as a cultural worker, those site visits are vital, right? I kind of briefly explained that earlier on how the structure, how a space is constructed, or a community or a town is formed, and how people navigate through that, or how they decorate that town. Well, in the sense of mural art or whatever have you, those become vital. And I do miss those. And I think this site visit become a foundation for my fieldwork research, right? And affirming and amplifying what those communities are doing. And, really a good way of doing the marketing and promotion of the agency's mission. And that is Art for All Oklahomans. That is one. We are really working hard in creating a folk and traditional art with the idea of being sustainable. How do we create a sustainable folk and traditional art program? So, and that can only happen with direct conversation with the cultural workers. Maybe when I say cultural workers, maybe I should define traditional artists, folk artists, whatever have you artists, right? And that's another complicated thing to define. But how do communities do art? Maybe that's the best way to ask that question. And then creating that is one thing that we're working on that I'm really excited about. So.
Well, I'm kind of excited to see any photographs that come out of your visits too.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you'd like to talk about that we've overlooked, or?
I don't think so. But this type of conversation, and to me in itself, what you're doing is this idea of creating that art, right? And I think this is an area that is not being, perhaps forgive my ignorance in that sense, that lack of documentation, right? And I think that is the biggest issues that I see, right? That this is not an artwork that you collect and have it at Sotheby's auction, right? So this, I feel like this type of activity is part of the preservation that I'm looking forward in folk and traditional art. How do you do that, and what are the mechanisms that are available for us to do so? And I think this is that art. So.
Well, I think one thing that came through really strongly is that whether we use the word art or not, it's the making of these relationships between these these creative expressions and people.
Yeah, beautifully said. Thank you for saying that. So,
well, you gave me that idea. All right. Well, thank you very much, Eyakem. I enjoyed talking with you, and I wish you the best of luck.
Oh, thank you so much, and thank you for doing this. Yeah, absolutely. I look forward to many more conversations. So.
Me too.
Yeah,
all
great.
right.
Great.
Bye for now.
Thank you. Have a wonderful afternoon.